Hey, welcome back to the None of Our Businesses podcast, the YouTube and podcast show where we talk about business issues from an accountant's perspective, and not just one accountant, but two accountants. With me this week, as always, is Charlie Zigman. How's it going, buddy?
Hi, everybody. Good. Thanks for joining us.
And we normally have Ty with us, but unfortunately, he couldn't make it this week, so he'll be here next week. But yeah, how's your week been, Charlie?
Oh, it's been busy. We've been dealing with that smoke. I know you know, but for our listeners, Portland's been covered in a blanket of smoke for a while, and we finally had the rain today, and so it's been kind of cooling down. And so, yeah, it's been really nice to breathe again.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely done with summer, right? So it's nice to see a little rain. So you got some articles for us this week. What do you got to kick us off with here?
Well, I thought since we're on a Zoom call, it might be good to start off with an article about Zoom calls. And so what I found is that in Harvard Business Review, there's an article called Remote Work Doesn't Have to Mean All-Day Video Calls. And so the author of the article is trying to make the point that, hey, everybody's working from home because of the pandemic. And that for a lot of companies means we're going to make meetings so that we have so many that it feels like we're at the office. And that's how we're going to all connect. But the article is looking at companies that have chosen to not do that and kind of some of the ways that they're going about that. And so the one that they're focusing in on is the company GitLab, which makes GitHub software. And it's got about 1,300 employees across 65 countries. So this whole need for how do we integrate with each other is a big deal to them. And so what their kind of logic is, they want people, instead of having scheduled all day every meeting, they want people to feel like they can work whenever they want, because their logic is it's always 9 to 5 somewhere in the world. And so that's kind of the way that they justify it. But what I thought was interesting about the article is they talk about the idea of asynchronicity, which is like, how often are we going to when two people are working together, are we going to hand off work, or are we going to work at the same time in the same document collaboratively? And so in order for you to have people who work in all the countries and on whatever time zone they want, there has to be this clean way that they can finish, pass it off to the next team, and let that guy start working on it. And so I thought it was just kind of interesting hearing about their approach to it. And I guess I want to get your take on whether or not you think that this idea of stopping work, passing it off to the next guy is superior to a team just having a schedule, working together and working at the same time on the same project. What do you think?
Yeah, I guess it's industry, to your point, I think it's probably industry specific. If you're talking about coding or something like that, or, some kind of computer programming kind of work or engineering, you probably need people working together, but in their walled off garden, for instance, of what they're doing on, and there's constant iterations of software code and all that stuff going on. But if you're talking about the accounting profession, it depends. I mean, I think, again, it depends on what side of the industry you're on. If you're talking about tax and audit, you probably want one person working on a document at a time in one area. If you have more than one person in that kind of, and very much so, there are stages in that kind of environment where, a staff person will kind of put together their work papers for either a tax return or an audit. And then that's kind of passed on for review. And then that's passed on to a partner review. And then that, there's different steps to it. So you wouldn't want somebody working in the same document after it's been passed off for review, unless it comes back to that person for revisions or notes or whatever it may be. In something like what we do at TCA for implementation services, I think, again, it's very specific. But one thing I found interesting about what you were talking about was the meeting aspect of it and the Zoom meeting. And I will say, from an efficiency standpoint, Zoom meetings can really wreck a day, where if you have people together talking about a certain issue or something like that, and you have all these meetings staggered and you're trying to cram work in between that, I could see that as being very inefficient. And in fact, personally, I've tried to stack my Zoom meetings back to back at either the front end or the back end of my day. And what that does is it allows me a large chunk of time to dedicate to actual work, or come up with the questions or, answers for those Zoom meetings, that to make those efficient as well. So everybody's not just talking in circles or feel unprepared for those. So I think that's really important. And I think everybody's coming to a new realization of how you're personally going to be efficient with a day, and hopefully you have the agency to be able to arrange your schedule that way. I know some of our colleagues that work at a public accounting firm probably don't have that luxury. Like meetings are scheduled for you, but if you're at a level where you can schedule your own meetings, I would highly recommend stacking them, back to back, or in the first and latter part of the day, or whatever makes sense to you. You know what I mean, I guess, but enough time left in between to be able to be efficient about your actual work.
Yeah, you definitely have to be like diligent about fitting it into your day and thinking about how it's going to make sense. I think that makes a lot of sense. You're right. The article was focused mainly on like software developers and whatnot, but I thought it was interesting because I found a lot of like parallels to accounting in it. Like, for example, they say that one of the key things that you can do to ensure that people are able to work together well across boundaries was to separate like responsibility for doing the task from responsibility for declaring it done. And so that to me was like the same idea as segregation of duties in accounting, where we're going to say, okay, one guy is going to write the check, the other guy's going to sign it, and therefore they have to agree on everything. The other one I thought was interesting that I'm not sure what your take is on this, but they have a concept called respecting the minimum viable change. And the idea of this concept is that when you're working in drafts and you're like going through different editing phases and you're going to turn it over to somebody else, there's kind of two ways you can do it. You can either like really work until it's completely done and then hand it over only once and be done, or you can choose to send in more rough drafts that have problems in them, but more often, on the hope that other people will see what you're doing and kind of, it will give them advance notice to, react to whatever it is that you're doing. And so I thought that was maybe interesting in accounting because if, for example, we share our projects with Ty or with somebody else more often, it might be hard at first because we would have more errors, but it would maybe allow us to not go down the wrong path more easily. And so, there's a fine line between how, turning it over too soon versus waiting too long. And so I guess I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think probably, like everybody's probably always strive in our profession, and I'm focusing on the accounting profession here. I think everybody's looking to strike that right balance of like oversight and review versus like, stopping at every point to get it okayed, I guess is the best way to say it. You want to have confidence enough in yourself. And I think, maturing through the ranks in an accounting profession, you get more confident in what you're doing, like a day one staff person or an AP clerk or something like that might have to ask lots of questions regarding individual transactions or work papers, and then as you move along in your career, I think you're used, with age comes wisdom, right? Like the more you've seen it, the more you understand what needs to happen and the more you see the big picture of it. And so but that then contrast that with nobody looking at, somebody just trusting that what they're doing is correct and nobody's looking at it. That's how mistakes happen. And definitely from an internal controls perspective, that's not good. So, I think review and like, and an open channel for dialogue on stuff and issues and things like that is always good. And I think that's what I was talking about when trying to strike a right balance. How much is overdoing it? How much are we sitting in a meeting chasing our tails talking about nothing or the same problem over and over again versus when you need to bring, questions and have them answered. And this is a good, scheduled time to do so, I guess. So you're trying to strike that right balance of, interaction with different levels and review the work of others and such, and make sure that, a second set of eyes gets on things. And then you're also then the person that's reviewing, you're taking time away from their day as well, which they have other things to do. So having that, I think, scheduled like the Zoom meetings, you know what I mean? Like once a week or once a month, depending on the frequency that things need to happen, or twice or three times during a project or an audit or a tax return, checking in with questions and stuff like that. I think, is probably like a good plan, but I think that's individually up to everybody to try and find that good balance of where it's not overdone or undertuned. overtuned or undertuned. So,
I agree. That makes sense. All right,
all
you got
right.
an article we can do?
Yeah, actually, this relates to Stripe. It's a for people that don't know, Stripe is a payment portal, and they do like event registrations, but they're also like a e-commerce payment portal kind of thing. But Stripe is playing, and they're giving out bonuses essentially of $20,000 if they leave big cities, but they'll get a 10% pay cut. And so the thinking is here is if they relocate from expensive cities like San Francisco, Seattle, New York, where the company has offices, if they move out, they'll get the 20 grand but they'll also have to take a 10% pay cut. And the reason being, a spokesman for the financial service and software company said, we want our employees to be able to make whatever life choices they feel are best for them without barriers. And so this goes back to, I think remote work is really here to stay, especially in the tech sector. But we see it in accounting more and more, I think, and especially accelerated through the pandemic, that I think it's here. And I think this is a good like canary in the coal mine for kind of the traditional, if you want to work at a big, kind of established conglomerate, big four, for instance, if you want to really stand out at a big four accounting firm, you need to be in New York or San Francisco. I think that may change, but I think this article kind of points to, like at least the first signs that may change. And so I'd like to get your opinion on this, though. Do you think they're doing it like out of generosity, or do you think this? I mean, I'm sure there was some financial decisions made behind the scenes here, that this 20,000 that they're giving to workers, they would be able to recoup in the 10% pay cut that they're giving these people. So I don't know. I'd kind of like to get. I think it's promising though for those individuals who were barely scraping by, having to live in Manhattan and work at Stripe, versus if they can move to, rural Kansas or Indianapolis or something and have a much lower cost of living, but still make a decent salary with only a 10% pay cut.
Yeah, I think that it totally makes sense that they're reacting to this whole thing, because you can kind of go either way on this. You can choose like, hey, if somebody leaves from their position and they're choosing to be out of the area, then I'm going to find somebody else new for that position. But of course, they don't want to do that. They're trying to find out solutions that are going to work for them and for the person who's moving. And so I think from that angle, it makes sense. And it's good to see them coming up with new kind of innovative ways to do that. I do think it's interesting because it's a little bit questionable. I mean, if you told me there was a $20,000 loan where they were going to then take 10% of my salary to pay the loan as we kind of went through the years, I would look at that as kind of a weird transaction that I probably wouldn't do. But I think in this case, it's not quite that same comparison, because we're looking at people who were likely wanted to do that already anyway. And so it's a little bit of a sunk cost for them to, they were already going to move, and it was either that or lose their job. So 10% of a pay cut doesn't maybe sound as bad as it otherwise would. But yeah, I think it's good that everyone is moving out. I think that's what it has to be, because it just doesn't make sense anymore to work remotely and to then pay such a gigantic share of your income to Manhattan rent or San Francisco rent, when all you're doing is being in Zoom meetings all day anyway. So, what's the point? And I personally would like to one day move out further away from. I'm already a little bit out of the city, but I'd like to move even further, because I think that just sounds so much more peaceful to me. So I'm biased in that way.
Yeah, and I think I'll channel Ty here in saying that I think the draw and the really like what makes a big city like New York or LA or Portland or Seattle or any of those places like a large metropolitan area is the attractions. And right now the attractions aren't there. Shows, dinner, dining, nightclubs, movies, really nice things like that. We said that before on the podcast, where that's the real draw of a metropolitan area. And because those aren't here, people are now thinking, well, if I'm just going to, just like you said, if I'm going to be in Zoom meetings and stuff, why am I paying this extra? Basically it's a surcharge for you being in the hub of everything. And that's not happening anymore. So you may see this, I think, eventually we'll probably see the pendulum swing the other way, where people are moving back into large metropolitan areas. Now, whether that's 2021, 2022, 2025, who knows at this point. But I think eventually the pendulum will swing back, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely feeling more long term now. It feels like companies are getting more and more deciding that they're going to have remote work forever. And so this issue that we're describing, I think, is going to just keep getting bigger and bigger.
All right, Charlie. In an article that should be titled as No Surprise to Anybody, FedEx logs record revenues on surge in packages. So apparently, during the pandemic, people have been ordering online more, and the shipping industry is up. Now, this one's specific to FedEx, and it says that their express business ballooned 16% for the last quarter. They reported earnings of 1.25 billion compared with only 750 billion last year. And so I guess revenues rose 13% from to a year ago, and shares were up 9%. So I guess the real reason I wanted to talk about this was, I guess consumer spending is there. It's like, I guess the economy's all right, and I guess I wasn't really thinking about record, gains for the shipping industry. And it's something I kind of don't think about on a daily basis. But I'd kind of like to get your take. Do we think this is going to continue? Do you think this is surprising at all? Or I guess, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it does seem like it's going to continue, and it's really interesting because you would think that with consumer spending going down, that we would expect FedEx to drop too. But I think it's interesting when you think about kind of the nature of the consumer spending. Like maybe people are spending the same amount as they were, but they're buying a larger percentage of what they buy using either Amazon or some other service that results in a single shipment, as opposed to like a semi truck driving all the way across the U.S. And so when I just think about the question of like, even if consumer spending stays the same, what percentage of people's consumer spend going to shipping companies? Seems like it would jump because everybody's trying to just trying to buy their things online. I guess it was surprising. The other thing I was thinking about is just with the election coming up and how USPS has a lot of challenges relating to that maybe FedEx doesn't have to handle to the same extent. And so I thought maybe that would put them in a position where comparatively to competitors that like USPS, that might, make it easier for them. But it is surprising, and it's surprising to see how consumer spending has stayed relatively strong even through this whole pandemic. I think people are just, maybe not coming to terms with it, or not willing to change their ways.
Yeah, and I think, like channeling Ty here again, the economy is based on people buying stuff, so we want people buying things. And there was actually a report this week that consumer spending was up still by 6% or something like that, but it's slowing. And so I think, this Q4 will really probably determine how 2020 is going to shake out. I would say it's probably hanging in there, but we'll see over holiday spend if the Q4 will turn it around, I guess, for the U.S. economy.
Yeah, the other thing I'm curious about is I wonder how, I have a feeling about how it might work, but I'd be curious to see how it actually works in terms of what is people's propensity to spend when it comes to receiving like unemployment versus wages that they work for, or that they know what it's going to be. And so I guess I'm wondering if it's easier for people to go out and spend, even though they may not have a job at the moment, but just getting unemployment checks that maybe were delayed and they're getting them all at once, or maybe they've just, in a very emotional kind of time. And so even though income is down, I can kind of imagine why somebody might still have high spending. Yeah. So I've got another article in Bloomberg that we can talk about called VMware Cuts Pay for Remote Workers Leaving Silicon Valley. And so it's very similar to what we were talking about earlier in the podcast, but it's just a little bit of a different take and another company's approach to that same problem, where everybody's planning on leaving all these high cost of living areas, and their companies are looking at making it permanent. Facebook and Twitter are doing the same thing. And so one of the ways that they've tried to help this whole transition is that Twitter came up with a one-time $1,000 work from home allowance for everyone. And so that's been, I guess, a positive kind of thing that's come from it. But people in the article, it said people familiar with the matters saw an 8 to 18% salary reduction. And so that's maybe what's funding these payments. And I guess the last thing I saw that I thought was interesting is that they said people against this idea said that it could be hard to have a culture if people could work from anywhere. And so I guess my question to you is, do you think that it is harder to have a culture when people are working, a company culture that is, when people are working from multiple destinations, or is that just two separate discussions that don't interplay?
Well, that's an interesting question because I think, and I think it's yet to be answered. I think we're all living in a new normal where, virtually, I mean, I participated in a virtual happy hour for one of our clients. And that was an interesting experience because normally at a happy hour, you can go and individually talk to, say a group of 3 or 4 people and have an interaction with them. But this was in front of like 15 to 20 people. And so it was different in a way, but familiar, I guess is the way to say it. And so I think that question is yet to be unanswered, but I think it's different because I think what we traditionally think about culture in a business as is, camaraderie between employees. And often that's had to I mean, I guess over the last 20 years, we've seen, like if anybody plays video games, I'm sure you have friends that live somewhere else around the world that you happen to like never have met physically in person, but, you talk to over a headset on a weekly basis, and I would consider some of my gaming friends, and we have rapport. So I guess, that's probably changed over the last 20 years as opposed to if you would have asked this question in like 1998 or something like that. But I think it's still evolving. It's not like everything is digital and we live in, like a virtual world or something all the time. I think, and we've talked about on this podcast before, some people are really itching for that, person to person contact and intermingling and, doing things in person and feel like it's really a necessary part of like what culture is. But then I think you probably have some people that like, you know, view this as a fine alternative. So I guess it's really up to the individual and company, and I hate to go back to the tech industry, but probably the tech industry would have a better, time at moving a company culture with people working remotely than like a hardware store or, like some kind of physical brick and mortar location or even accounting firms. It's not like even if you worked at a firm that has offices all throughout the country, the culture in one part of the country's firm would be different from the culture on the west coast to the east coast or the midwest or wherever these offices are, because that company or that location is filled with people with different attitudes, personalities, wants, needs, business wise. Like I think it just depends. So I think, and it depends on what you are we taught, and the size of the company I think matters too. I think culture is much easier to cultivate and have a good, strong culture and work environment in, a small to medium sized one location business, but that's very difficult to replicate at scale, So I think there's all these defining factors I think that are sitting out there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it because it's like you said, different offices are going to have a different feel, but at the same time, like McDonald's has this feel, even though it's international, it's all over, but there is this consistency to it that makes it clear that there's some kind of an international culture built into that company that comes through in some way. But like you said, I think it has to do with what it is that you're doing, because I think that it's a lot easier to install culture in an area where what you're doing is very menial. Everyone's following the rules, and there's not a lot of opportunity for kind of creativity. So it's easier to prescribe a culture as a company in that case versus a team of architects positioned all over the world where everyone's doing their own thing. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting, and just another example of the whole question of should you get a pay cut if you move out of where you're, how are you being paid? Is it on your value or is it on your cost of living in that area that you're happening to be at? The only other interesting thing I saw in the article was that it was talking about how plenty of people are just lying about where they live by setting up false addresses and then just saying that they've not moved there. And the company points out that, hey, it was like, sure, you can lie to us and we want you to be honest, but we want to also remind you that that is like a government and legal and a tax question that really has nothing to do with, you can lie to us about where you live, but like your payroll taxes are still supposed to be based around where you actually are. And so I thought that was kind of another interesting angle on it, that they're trying to leverage the government as a way to, you know, get people to be honest about where they're living. So yeah.
That is interesting. All right. So our last article is kind of more lighthearted article here, but I thought it had an interesting accounting twist on it. So this comes from CNN Business, and it says Chuck E. Cheese wants to destroy 7 billion prize tickets. So we talked about in a previous episode that the parent company for Chuck E. Cheese has gone bankrupt. And so they're in a bankruptcy filing. So what this relates to, I guess, is in June, before the bankruptcy filing was issued, Chuck E. Cheese had entered in with a contractor to print and make $2 million worth of tickets for future use in the chain. Well, now that they're in bankruptcy court, they actually have to ask for permission to be able to spend this money to buy the tickets that are already produced. And essentially what they're going to do is they're going to produce the tickets, buy them, and then destroy them. And it's estimated that over $9 million in Chuck E. Cheese prizes could be earned with those tickets. And so I thought it was interesting, and something that we don't think about when you're in like that bankruptcy court is you actually have to apply for permission to be able to pay bills. And so especially a bill of this size, $2 million. But I'd kind of like to get your take on that, Charlie. What do you think?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I've read about this before. I've never actually been through a bankruptcy or helped anyone through one, but I've read some things about it, and I've heard this idea called preference payments, which it's like where you're choosing which vendors to pay in a way that is immoral based on what you want to have happen. And so you're like willing to pay vendors that you think you might have a future relationship with. And so that's why this seemingly innocuous thing of like just paying a bill you already owed can become something kind of controversial. And so I think that's kind of interesting. I also love the idea of just Chuck E. Cheese buying back all of these tickets in order to keep them from getting out into the hands of all of the 6-year-olds that are sort of ready to buy paper airplanes, and kind of how much financial chaos can those tickets cause. But apparently it's enough to warrant, buying the containers and burning them all. So yeah, I think it's very interesting. And I guess I'm sad that Chuck E. Cheese is going away. I don't know, maybe not.
I don't know. I'm not a big fan of rats selling pizza, but
Yeah.
whatever.
Charles E. Cheese. Yep.
I never thought it was a very good mascot. I just don't understand. I'm surprised they're still around, to be honest.
It's not very appealing, like, because I have kids, and so I've been in a Chuck E. Cheese a few times, and I gotta tell you that there's nothing, you never like go to a Chuck E. Cheese and feel like, like you're really doing something great for your kids. Oh my God, we're showing them the way of Chuck E. Cheese, you just leave and it's like any other place you've ever been. So, good. Get them out of here. That's what I say. All right, everybody, that was our show. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week for more insight into the world of business from an accountant's perspective. Thank you.
See you guys.